What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you for your questions. If your question doesn't get answered in this video, then just go ahead and copy it onto the bottom of this post, as I might answer next week or next time. And if you have any new questions, post those as well. And don't forget to upvote all the questions that you want answered, because although I've been getting a lot of questions, there's not that many with a lot of upvotes. So make sure that you click the little heart button on all the ones that you want answered. So let's get started. So Simone asks, since you don't want to work for somebody else, have you ever considered becoming an official translator or similar? There was a point in my life that when I thought that maybe I wanted to become a translator, but as of right now, I definitely don't want to be a translator. And I probably would only take translation work if either I was just really stuck in life and I needed money to eat, or I was going to be on the streets, or there was something that I was truly passionate about that didn't exist in, Japanese or English, and I just wanted it to exist in the other language. And so out of sheer passion, I might go and translate something. And I've thought about doing that before on certain things. I might do that in the future. Like, there's not that many meditation manuals in Japanese. And so I think it would be really cool to translate the Mind Illuminated into Japanese, although that would be a huge project. And so that'd probably be something I do pretty far down the road when I'm either retired or something else, because it just take up a lot of time and be a huge passion project. And I don't know how much would come out of it. But basically the reason why I don't want to be a translator is, a few things. First of all, it's extremely tedious and mostly just really difficult and really boring. Because, first of all, you have to remember that if you're going to be a translator, most of the things in the world that need to be translated aren't very exciting. It's like car manuals, signs, iPhone apps and things like that. These type of things, they're really boring. You're not going to be interested in them intrinsically. And that is where most of the work exists for translation, right? When you think of a translator, you think I'm going to translate manga or anime or movies. And it's cool if you get to do that. But, only a minority of people who are translators probably get to really work on something that they're passionate about and then and that they like. And so if you're going to become a translator, then you have to kind of be willing to at least go through a period when you're translating lots of really boring stuff in order to build up your resume so that you can even get jobs where you're translating kind of stuff that you want. And the next is that I don't really think it pays that well unless you have worked your way up to the point where you're translating really important stuff, which is going to take a while. And so you're probably going to have to work really hard and not get paid that much. And also, for me, I'm someone who, one of the reasons why I said I don't like to work for someone else is because I, just due to my personality and how I am, my collar's all weird again. I think half of this is the camera angle. Always bothers me. Okay. I like to do my own thing. Whenever someone tells me what to do and I'm just doing something for someone else, I cannot experience any motivation at all. It just feels like torture for me. When I used to work at a grocery store, it was the worst thing ever. I need to be doing something because I want to do it, because I'm either just intrinsically like it, or I'm passionate about it, or it's going to lead to something else that I am intrinsically interested in. And so the idea of taking something else that someone else wrote and then just translating into another language, doesn't really sound exciting to me at all, because I want to write my own thing, right? I want to write what I'm excited about in the different languages that I know, and my unique message that I have to get across that I hope will help people and things like that. I don't really want to just be the, baitai, what's the right word in English? The medium in which someone else expresses themselves through me. Some people might like doing that, and that might suit them better, but for me, that just sounds like torture. And also, people always say that translating is creating again for the first time, and that may be true to a certain extent, but still, you're not really getting any credit at all, and also, they're not your ideas originally, right? Even if you have to be creative in finding a way to express the same ideas in a way that will work well in the target language, they're still not your ideas, and you have almost no control over what you're going to say. If you don't agree with the person whose ideas are translating, too bad, you have to translate their ideas. But the biggest reason why I don't want to translate and I'm not interested in translation at all is that, especially when you're talking about languages like Japanese and English that are so different from each other, even if you're the best translator in the world, your translation sucks. And that's because Japanese and English are too different, like just intrinsically. And so no matter how high your skill level is as a translator, your translation is going to be incomplete. It's not going to get across the full nuance and the full meaning of the original, right? And that's just because there's concepts that exist in English that don't exist in Japanese and vice versa. And so, for example, there might be a sentence in Japanese that's, 5 words long. Except in English, we don't have those same 5 words. And maybe there's one word that in Japanese, like what's like gyakugire, like that, right? We don't have a word like gyakugire. And so you have 2 choices, right? You can say something different that's also 5 words long and gets across a similar idea, or you can use more words to recreate the Japanese concept using English concepts and then get closer to the original meaning, but then the form is different because now you have like 2.5 sentences instead of just a 5-word succinct single sentence. And even in that last scenario, you're missing some of the nuance because it's different to read 2.5 sentences and get the meaning than it is to read 1 word and get the full meaning succinctly. It feels different. And so basically, you are always making sacrifices when you're translating, It's like there's all these different things that you wish to preserve, like the original nuance, the like feel that you get when you're reading it, the voice of the author, the actual meaning, all these things. But it's literally impossible to keep all of them because the language is too different. So you're always choosing, okay, well in this particular scenario, how can I try to get the best of both worlds while losing the minimum amount? And so really from my point of view, like what the goal of a translator is to make a translation that sucks as least as possible, like that sucks as little as possible, but it's always going to suck at the end of the day. And I once heard this metaphor that I really liked, which was that translation is like trying to convert a piano piece into a piece for a single violin. So, when you're playing piano, you have 10 fingers, you can play up to 10 notes at the same time. On a violin, you have like 4 strings, and I mean, I don't even know how violins work, so I don't even really know how many strings you can play at one time. But even if it's like all 4 at the same time, that's only 4. And so basically, piano, you can have like a melody and a bass line or whatever. Like you can have multiple things going on at once. With the violin, you can really only have one thing going on at once. And I mean, if you're a violin player and you're like, oh no, that's actually technically not true, it's okay. Like you get the point of the metaphor, hopefully. So basically, that's why I see it reverse in the screen. That's why it's confusing. But so I mean, a lot of times I experience reading something in Japanese and being like, wow, that's a cool sentence. Like, that is so awesome. It's like a really short, succinct message that packs a punch. And sometimes I'm interested, so I'm like, how would you even translate that into English? And so if available, I'll go and check what the English translation is. Like if I'm watching a show on Netflix, sometimes I'll be like, man, I wonder what the English was. And I'll turn on the English subtitles just for that sentence. And then I'll just be disgusted. I'll be like, ugh, it's not even close. And then I'll be like, well, could I do something? Could I do better? Well, maybe a little bit better, but I still I can't think of a way to get across what this really means, like how this feels to understand in Japanese in English. It's impossible. And so basically, it would just crush my soul constantly for me to try to be a translator because I'd just be ruining great stuff, right? Like, and it's both ways. It's not just Japanese into English, but that's what I have more experience with. So it would just be like, I just feel like I was just doing this disgusting act of watering down and like tainting the original. And the idea of just doing that all day, combined with all the other things I said, ugh, that sounds like torture. Like, definitely would not want to do that. Now, interpretation would be probably better than translation because it's more pragmatic, right? Like with translation, it's written down so you can take your time, you can do the best job that you think you can do. But with interpretation, it's like in the moment. You only have like milliseconds to think. And so you're basically just trying to get the message across. If you like nuance and stuff is not even that important anymore. It's just like get the job done. And I've done interpretation work before and I like it way better than translation because of that. And it's kind of more exciting. You're like, get to go around and do different stuff and be interacting with other people. But still at the end of the day, first of all, it's extremely exhausting. and just taxing. And so it's like not that fun to do intrinsically. It's like fun to do if you're doing it for like half an hour, but like if you're going to do it for like an hour straight or multiple hours straight, and then there's like this pressure, right? Because it's like there's these two groups of people trying to have a conversation, and if you fuck up, then you're going to fuck up, like you're going to fuck it up for both of them, right? There's all this pressure, like you have to hear every single word, you have to speak correctly the first time. It's just so difficult and so much pressure that I mean, I wouldn't want to live a life where I'm doing that constantly. That sounds awful. And also, again, I want to be the one who's expressing my ideas. I don't want to just be a medium for other people expressing their ideas. It's just not my style. It's not my personality. It's not what's going to make me feel fulfilled. And so I definitely just don't think that's for me. Except, like I said before, if I was super passionate about a certain work, I might do it. And if I'm ever like super tight on cash and that's the only thing I can find to not go homeless, I'll probably still do it. So Sevi asks, should we limit how many cards we get from a specific source? Example, someone really likes a long-running anime with hundreds of episodes, and the majority of their cards are coming from that. Is it fine as long as they continue to find I+1 sentences? Yeah, I would say it's totally fine. Because in the first stages of learning a language, through immersion, your goal is really to become able to understand. And even if what you're immersing with isn't exactly what you want to model your speech after, it doesn't really matter if it's something that you're really engaged with and it really helps you. Like it's something that you can easily spend a lot of time with and learn to understand well. So if you really like a long running anime and you can spend hours watching that every day, then that's like a really good thing for your Japanese, because if you can learn to understand anime well, then you're not too far away from being able to understand other domains of Japanese well. And as long as you're finding I+1 sentences all the time, then you're learning, period. Like, what should happen eventually is that you'll get to the point where you're rarely finding I+1 sentences because you know pretty much all the words that the author who wrote the show tends to use. And so maybe, like let's say you have a goal of making 10 sentence cards a day. It'll get to a point where through this show alone, you won't be able to find the 10 sentence cards anymore. And once you get to that point, yeah, you should probably start immersing with more wider sources. You can keep watching that show for sure, but you probably want to also be immersing with other things that will continue to grow your ability so that you don't kind of plateau and stop growing. But until you reach that point, there's no reason to not just continue doing the anime. Because if this anime is kind of just a gold mine for you, right? Because you like it and there's tons of I+1 sentences, then just mine that, just keep going, just keep mining the mine until it dries up. Or until you get bored. So William Underwood asks, would love to hear you do a post-mortem of Krashen's 5 hypotheses. What he got right, what he got wrong. On top of that, Krashen never went into detail on the actual mechanism that makes input so effective, so it would be cool to hear your thoughts on that. I know you've addressed these things before in various videos, but it would be cool to have it all in one place with a summary of your most up-to-date views. Okay, cool question. So I have pulled up Krashen's 5 hypotheses. Here I have the Wikipedia page in front of me, so I'll read Wikipedia's like one sentence summary of each one. So basically, just give some context. So Stephen Krashen, the linguist in the 80s, came out with this thing called the input hypothesis, and what you might have heard that how you might understand the input hypothesis is that it's basically saying that basically the input hypothesis is the name given to 5 specific hypotheses that Stephen Krashen came out with. And your understanding, I mean, it may be like some of the, like one of the 5 hypotheses is actually called the input hypothesis, which states that language is acquired through I+1 input. So that might be what I was going to say a second ago, is that might be what's in your head when you think of the input hypothesis, but also the input hypothesis can refer to that and 4 other ones. So I'm just going to go down the list here on Wikipedia. I'll read the sentence out loud and then talk about it. And I also just want to say that I don't think that I have a perfect understanding of language acquisition. I think that there's a lot of mysteries left to be discovered when it comes to language acquisition. And the longer that I continue to learn languages and the more research that I do about learning languages and the more kind of case studies that I see, the more that I actually in a way, it's like the less confident I become in my convictions. Because if you do enough broad research, you realize there's exceptions to every rule, and you kind of realize there might be other explanations that can explain the same set of facts. And so, like, now I become, in a way, more open-minded and less kind of attached to the original ideas of AJAT. But at the same time, there's certain things that I can say for certain are almost either wrong or just not thorough enough to give a full explanation. So I just wanted to say that. I don't want this to sound like, hey, I have all the answers. Here's what Stephen Krashen got wrong. Let me tell you what is correct. Because, these are just my own current hypotheses that will probably continue to get updated and be, still have flaws and things like that. So anyway, so it says over here, Wikipedia overview: the 5 hypotheses that Krashen proposed are as follows. The input hypothesis. This states that learners progress in their knowledge of the language when they comprehend language input that is slightly more advanced than their current knowledge. Krashen called this level of input I+1, where I is the learner's interlanguage and +1 is the next stage of language acquisition. So I kind of see this as an oversimplistic explanation. This might be the kind of core mechanism of how language acquisition tends to work, but it's definitely not comprehensive. Like, one really easy way to kind of think about this is, like, when you first start listening to a new language, you're not even going to be able to parse the sounds at all, right? You're not going to be able to tell when one word ends and the next word begins. You're not going to be able to hear what consonants and vowels are being actually pronounced, right? Like, it's really just going to sound like a blur of sound. Yet, when you keep listening, even if you're just sitting in a completely dark black room listening to the language and you have no idea what it means, it's 100% incomprehensible, the more you listen, the better you'll be able to parse the sounds. You'll start being able to hear the syllables more clearly. You'll start being able to hear where one word starts and another word ends. You'll be able to start picking out specific patterns of sound, particular words. Yet, you haven't comprehended anything yet. So it doesn't really make sense that the only mechanism of language acquisition is through comprehending input, because clearly this is one example of acquisition happening without you comprehending anything. And also, there's plenty of examples of people who clearly understand the language close to perfectly. Like, you can give them like, they can read really difficult books. You could give them a test on the book. They could prove that they accurately understood all the content of the book. Yet they may still make basic grammar mistakes when they speak the language. And you could say that this is because of bad habits. And I think that is a big component of it. But it still just kind of doesn't explain how you can, like, under Krashen's view, if you already understand the whole language, then that should mean that you've already acquired it all, which means that it should exist in your head and you should be able to use it yourself. Whereas in reality, it seems like people can understand the language, yet still be missing fundamental components of it, right? Another example is things like pitch accent, right? Like, pitch accent is just not necessary to understand Japanese, and if you learn Japanese later in life and your first language isn't tonal and doesn't have pitch accent, you probably won't acquire pitch accent, but you'll still be able to acquire the whole language. And so, Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis doesn't really explain why this happens to adults, but it doesn't happen to children, right? Because Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis kind of assumes that adults and children are literally the same. And this clearly isn't the case, because, like, Japanese children, by the time they're like 4 or 5 years old, they already speak with perfect pitch accent, but there's tons of foreign speakers, even AJATers who didn't output at all for the first few years, who still completely just missed pitch accent, and they didn't, when they speak, they are not consistent in their pitch accent at all. So Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis can't really explain this at all either. And so these are just some kind of flaws that I see in this simple explanation of how language acquisition works. But I don't really have a better explanation. I think that what is actually going on in the brain when language acquisition is happening is extremely complicated, and really we can only speculate at best. Like, the linguist Stephen Chomsky proposed that there might be certain limitations on language or how should I say, he kind of had this idea of universal grammar, which means that that every human language, although they appear very different on the surface, there might be certain things that every single human language have in common. And the reason for that is that there are certain like biological constraints in our brain when it comes to language. So for example, like every language has like verbs, adjectives, and nouns. And like, I don't really know what they are, but there's a long list of things that linguists think they've identified that are consistent within every language. And so his kind of idea was that he had a model of principles and parameters, which is that when you're born, your brain already knows that there's certain things that just aren't possible in human language and certain things that are possible. And because of this, and it might even have a list of certain things to like check off. Like, your brain might know, like, okay, so word order, there's only 3 possibilities. Is it like subject, object, verb, or like verb, subject, object, or whatever? Like, I mean, no, there's more than 3 possibilities, but your brain might just know that, and instead of just starting with a complete blank slate and then figuring it out completely through inductive reasoning, it might actually have a list of possibilities, and it'll be narrowing down the possibilities through deductive reasoning. He proposed that might be part of the process of language learning, and that explains why children can learn languages so quickly in spite of having kind of poor quality input. And you might think well, babies don't have poor quality input. They get thousands of hours of input and so on and so on. But at the same time, the input that only tiny fractions of the input that babies actually hear are comprehensible, and a lot of times they're very partial. It's like they're just getting bits of pieces of a conversation here or there. They might and all the conversation they get is normally unscripted, messy speech and all this other stuff. Like if you're a baby, in a place around the world where they don't have TV or anything, right? Then you're pretty much never hearing clean scripted speech with full sentences that, you're just hearing native speak, and native speech has a lot of mistakes contained within it, yet babies somehow figure out on their own which stuff are mistakes and which stuff aren't. So anyway, I don't remember it that well, but he had a pretty good argument for what he called the poverty of stimulus, which was that babies actually don't have that quality input, that high quality of input, and so it doesn't make sense that they reach a perfect understanding of the language given the input that they have. And I think there might be something to this, it might be partially true, his whole idea about how there might be a lot of language software that comes built into the brain. And it could be that that is why you can get better at hearing the language just through listening to it, is because your brain already knows, okay, this is language. Language has certain fundamental properties and so on. And fundamentally, I definitely have felt that even when I'm messing around with Chinese or when I was learning Japanese, I felt that I acquired things even when my input wasn't comprehensible. I would just be listening to stuff all day, never really understanding anything, and then I just suddenly know what a word means. Or I'd suddenly be able to intuitively grasp the meaning of a grammar structure. And so I think that there's how acquisition really works is a really big, complicated picture. And I'm sure comprehensible input has something to do with it, and it's probably something big, but it's definitely not the whole picture. And what is the whole picture? I don't know. Linguists don't agree on this, and I don't really know either. So I'm still really open-minded on that, but I think that's probably overall the biggest mystery of how does language acquisition actually happen. So the next one, the acquisition learning hypothesis claims that there is a strict separation between acquisition and learning. Krashen saw acquisition as a purely subconscious process and learning as a conscious process, and claimed that improvement in language ability was only dependent upon acquisition and never on learning. So I think, again, this one is also partially true, but not fully true. I think that having the mental framework of acquisition and learning is very useful pragmatically, but in reality, I think the line between the two might be a lot more blurred than Krashen tends to imply. And in my mind, I've had experiences where, I remember I used to pronounce the word pronunciation incorrectly. If you watch my 3-hour video, I repeatedly say pronunciation instead of pronunciation. And then people pointed it out in the comments, And I was like, what? And then I looked it up, and I was like, oh, wow, it's pronunciation. And then there was a few times after that where I said pronunciation, and then I was like, oh, crap, it's actually pronunciation. And then after that, I just started saying it correctly. And I never would say it wrong after that. And now, even if I'm not thinking about it at all, and I'm just speaking unconsciously, like, I'm thinking about the content, I'm not thinking about the form of my speech at all, I'll still say it correctly. I'll say pronunciation. And so this kind of seems like some learning that I did affected my unconscious model of the language. This is just one example. Like, I have other examples in my own experience that I've experienced, like little things where also, like, I used to not know the difference between which and that. Like, I used to say, let's see, like, man, it's hard to think of an example. Like, the correct way to use the two words is like you said, my office, which is on the third floor, has blue walls. That's how you use which. But you would have to say, but if you said, my office that's on the third floor has blue walls. And that means, and they're both grammatically correct, but they mean something different. Because if you said, my office, which is on the third floor, or the second floor, whatever I said, that means, like, that implies that you have one office, and it happens to be on the third floor. But if you said, my office that's on the third floor has blue walls, that implies that you have multiple offices, and the one that's on the third floor is the one that has blue walls. If I just change the color and the story, sorry. And so, basically, I didn't understand that distinction, and I would use which when you had to use that. I would say, like, my office, which is on the third floor, has blue walls, or whatever. And so, I didn't even know that there was a difference. And then someone emailed me, like, saying, who, like, read my post on the MI website, and they were like, hey, you use these words wrong. And I looked it up, and I learned the difference. And then at first, the same thing happened. I messed up a bunch of times, and then I caught myself, and then I corrected it. But now I mostly never get it wrong, and it's, like, intuitive. Like, when I read it when I read someone else use the wrong one, it intuitively sounds weird. I was like, oh no, you have to use that in there, not that. And it's intuitive. It feels just like, how I know that the big red dog is correct and the red big dog is incorrect. Yet I kind of initiated this learning consciously. And so really, yeah, I think that it's more of like a grade spectrum going from acquisition to learning and back. And I don't really know the exact relationship between the two, but also, like, I know that, like, for me now, when I listen to Japanese, I can notice the pitch accent. And like, just yesterday I was listening to this one YouTuber who was speaking in standard Japanese, but I started to notice that, like, some of his pitch accent sounded funny. And the more I listened, the more I realized that, yeah, he must not be, like, from Tokyo, because he, like, pretty consistently messes up pitch accent. But I actually notice it intuitively. It's not conscious knowledge. It sounds weird to me now, even when I'm not looking for it at all. But I know that I didn't used to be this way, and it was only through consciously studying pitch accent and consciously paying attention to pitch accent that this happened. And so, really, I think, yeah, it just seems much more blurred to me, the two. And I kind of think that, like, even when you go to school and you learn how to write and you learn, like, all the rules of stylistic prose and so on, that is kind of an act of using learning to kind of modify what you've acquired. And I think it's kind of similar. It's a similar process when you get to a high level in the foreign language and you realize that there's a lot of things that your brain didn't acquire for you. You kind of have to consciously go and edit it and change those things. And it kind of does start to become intuitive after a while. But it's also hard to say whether this process of, like, consciously practicing an aspect of the language, changing your habit, and then feeling that it becomes intuitive, it's hard to say whether that is truly acquisition or that is just normal skill learning, or like normal skill acquisition. Because, like, if you learn an instrument, like you learn how to play guitar, at first it's going to be very conscious, right? Like, okay, put my finger here, put my finger here. But once you get good, it becomes completely intuitive, and you just know, your fingers just know where to go. Like, you think of a melody, your fingers can just know where to go. Just like walking, right? It's like you don't have to think about how to walk. It just happens, and you don't fall down. And so this is kind of normal skill learning, where it starts through conscious practice, and as you master it, it goes into the unconscious. So it could be that there's certain aspects of language learning is actually this traditional skill development, which is separate from language acquisition, which is when it's like subconscious from the start, from the beginning. And sometimes I feel that there is a difference and it feels a little bit different, like when you're comparing how the two feel in your mind. Like I know that English tends to feel different to me than Japanese feels, but I still don't know like the details. All I know is that it seems fishy to really think of them as 100% separate because there does seem to be interaction between the two. So the next is the monitor hypothesis, states that consciously learned knowledge can only be used to monitor language output. It can never be the source of spontaneous speech. So this is kind of, this relates to what I just said a second ago. I mean, when you first learn, for example, the day that I learned the pronunciation, right? Like the day I learned that it's not pronunciation, it's pronunciation. That day, that conscious knowledge didn't really help me that much, right? Like it didn't affect it didn't change my spontaneous speech, right? My spontaneous speech was still pronunciation, and then I had to fix it. So at the beginning, it was just like Krashen says it is, but after I did it a few times, it changed, and then my spontaneous speech was pronunciation the first time. And I know that this was the same with pitch accent too. Like before, I would go to say something, and in my mind, it would be like for example, if it would be like, kiteru yo. If I want to be like, yeah, I'm listening, kiteru yo. And then I'd be like, oh wait, no, kiku is heiban, so it must be kiteru. Like, kiteru yo. But now, it's all, like, for those words that I know well, it's, like, pretty much always heiban the first time. It's just kiteru yo. And I know it's that. And that's the one that sounds right. And it would never be kiteru. And so, I no longer have to correct it. It just comes up right the first time. And this is kind of a habit. And again, I don't know if this is true language acquisition or it's just normal skill development that has been relegated to an unconscious habit. But either way, I mean, and at that point, maybe you don't even call it conscious knowledge. Maybe you just call it that you're using conscious knowledge to build a motor habit, and then that habit becomes unconscious. So if you wanted to kind of define it that way, then what Stephen Krashen says is true. Like conscious knowledge can only be used to monitor output. It can't be the source of speech. But if you continue to use conscious knowledge to monitor your speech, the source of your speech will change in accordance to that. Perhaps out of some sort of language acquisition, perhaps just out of habit. So I don't really know the details of that either. And then the natural order hypothesis states that language is acquired in a particular order and that this order does not change between learners and is not affected by explicit instruction. So, I mean, this one doesn't really matter at all, like in terms of if you're a language learner. But I've heard that this has been proven to not be true. Like if you're a native English speaker and you're learning Chinese, you acquire structures in a different order than if you're a Japanese person learning Chinese. And they've they've done studies to prove this. But I think the real point of this hypothesis is that conscious instruction doesn't really affect the order of unconscious acquisition. And this is probably mostly true. I mean, again, I don't really know either, because what I think happens is that basically if we assume that Stephen Krashen's first hypothesis is true, right, that you acquire through understanding messages in the language, then what can happen is that you might consciously learn a structure in the language or a word in the language, and then you get input. So someone uses that structure. You hear the structure, you don't understand it, then you recall what you learned, and you kind of apply that, and then you understand it retroactively. Well, now you just directly understood input in the language. And so now your brain might be able to acquire it, right? It's similar to how Stephen Krashen has the example of, like, if someone holds up a red ball, and then you don't know the word red, but you know the word ball, and then someone says this is a red ball, you might be able to infer, oh, well, perhaps the sound red means red. And so basically this visual stimuli is basically filling in the missing knowledge and allowing you to comprehend and therefore acquire. Well, I think that conscious knowledge could do the same job, right? The conscious knowledge could fill in the missing piece, and then you understand it, and then you acquired it. So this means that what conscious knowledge you have is going to change what you can comprehend, and then what you comprehend is going to change what you acquire, according to Stephen Krashen, which means that you can't really say for sure that implicit instruction will be completely unrelated to acquisition, or at least it doesn't make sense. And I mean, I know that conscious studying does affect acquisition because like the words that I made a card for, that like when I would have a sentence card for a word in Anki, I know that I would acquire that word much more quickly and much more like at a much more higher rate than the words that I didn't have in Anki. But in Anki, I was just consciously memorizing it. And I think it's a similar thing. I memorize the meaning in Anki consciously. Then when the word comes up, I recall the meaning. I understand the sentence due to recalling the meaning. And then now I have a direct connection, or my unconscious brain has a direct connection between the mentalese, which is the understanding, and then the form, the sentence. And so basically, it's not that the conscious knowledge is going directly into my unconscious, but it's playing the role of improving comprehensibility, which therefore allows me to acquire. So now that I've really thought about it, this one seems kind of wrong too. And then the last one is the effective filter hypothesis. This states that learners' ability to acquire language is constrained if they are experiencing negative emotions such as fear or embarrassment. As such times, the effective filter is said to be up. So, I mean, I don't really have any direct experience that would seem to relate to this, but intuitively it makes sense that it's true. And I would wager that this can actually be spread out to more than just negative emotions. And it probably has to do with beliefs in general and motivations. I think that your mental state has probably a lot to do with whether you acquire or not as an adult. I think that, because one thing that I notice is that people who have a good accent in a foreign language tend to be people who value having a good accent and who care a lot about having a good accent. And people who have a bad accent tend to be the people who don't care about having a good accent and they're not bothered by it at all. And so that kind of makes me think that like one of the biggest keys to having a good accent is just wanting to have a good accent. And I think that like there is a kind of link between your conscious and your unconscious. If you consciously value something, your unconscious mind will do more work around that thing, right? It's like if you are working on a problem, like a math problem, right? And you can't solve it, then you go to bed and you wake up and now you suddenly have the answer, right? This means that while you were sleeping, your unconscious mind was still chugging away at the problem. And so this is kind of one example of you work hard on something consciously, like something's important, you show your mind that consciously something is important, and then your unconscious mind helps you out a little bit. And I think this is true with accent, where if you're just someone who's like, yeah, I want to have a good accent, it's important to you, your brain just pays more attention to that. And I think this extends beyond accent too. It also seems to be with grammar, right? It just seems to be like people who are always really paranoid about like sounding good in the language and like don't want to sound bad and don't want to make mistakes. Those people, when they do AJAT, they walk away with like normally a really complete model of grammar and a good accent. But people who really kind of just don't care, a lot of times they tend to make a lot of basic grammatical mistakes and things, even if they get a lot of input. And so when I've really examined these two people, like if you go off Katsumoto's original philosophy, it doesn't make sense because Katsumoto's original philosophy is the only thing that matters is input. If you get enough input, you will become perfect, and that's the end of the story. And so I was like, how could these people get so much input and still walk away with an incomplete model of the language? And the only explanation I had was that they must have outputted too early and built bad habits. But clearly that's part of it maybe, but it's not the whole thing. And there was even people who didn't output at all for the first couple years, and they still walked away with basic grammar mistakes and stuff. And so in my mind, like when I looked at all the case studies I could, it seems like the biggest difference is that the people who care just get better, and the people who don't. And so also, I like Katsumoto talked a lot about beliefs, and beliefs seem to affect a lot of things in life, like when it comes to capabilities, right? Like if you believe that you can't do something, you normally can't do it. And it could be that if you think that you're always going to suck, then you don't get, like that person doesn't get as good as the person who is like convinced that they're going to get native level. And I was convinced that I was going to get native level for a lot of my time learning Japanese, and that belief might have really helped me, because your brain's probably not going to put that much work into trying to do something that you believe is impossible, right? Seems like a waste of energy. And so I think that, and this is kind of, again, just a hypothesis, but I would think that your mental state has more than just negative emotions, including negative emotions, probably has a lot to do with the result of how much you acquire. And I don't think it's as simple as like, oh, if you are experiencing negative emotions, you won't acquire anything, right? I think it's more like, your engine's going to be moving a little bit slower than it could if you're experiencing negative emotions. It's not an on or off thing. It's like, we can have a hypothetical ideal psychological state, which is where, it's really important for you to get really good. You're really confident in yourself. You're like, just having lots of positive emotions, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to get really, really good. And the other one might be like, I suck. This is impossible. I mean, I don't even really want to be that good anyway. That'd be like the worst one. And so even that person, they're still going to make progress through immersing, like a lot. Like, they'll probably still eventually reach fluency, but it's probably going to be slower, and their results are probably going to be lower quality. So I'd say that this is a really important factor in language learning that is probably good to take into account, but it's hard for me to make definite statements about it, because again, it's like theoretical, and it's not something I can be sure about, or I can't really be sure about the extent to which this stuff does influence the rest of your language acquisition, and how it does influence it. So anyway, that was pretty long, but those are my current views on Stephen Krashen's 5 hypotheses. I think they're a good starting point, but they clearly don't have that much explanatory power when you really think critically about them and compare it to the reality. And so I'm kind of conflicted about it, because on one hand, it's a really good tool to try to bring new people into an AJAT or MIA type philosophy, right? Because most people are super blue pilled about input, right? Input and immersion. So it's a good way to be like, hey, look, there's science that is showing that this is true, and it's really effective on that area. But when you really get critical about it, and you're like, okay, I want to get to native level, how can Stephen help me? Then it kind of breaks down a little bit. And so I think I probably will talk about Krashen in the future, but I'll also kind of probably just talk about it like that, saying it's a really good starting point, but they're really overly simplistic ideas that need to be transcended if we want to go as far as we can with this thing. So Zachary Owens asks, how many water bottles do you go through a day? I mean, I don't really count. Probably around 5 or 6, I'd say. Speaking of water. Josh Randall asks, do you have any tips to stay mindful while listening? I often find I will be listening to an audiobook or similar, and I'll hit a streak where I understand a full sentence or more, and then I kind of latch onto it, as if to make sure I fully understand it. Of course, the audio keeps going, and I feel like I'm actually missing out by trying to parse the things that I just heard. So by mindfulness, I guess I mean staying in the moment of listening or something. So yeah, so I wouldn't really call that being mindful, because when I think of mindfulness, what I think of is like metacognitive awareness. So basically in awareness of what your mind is doing moment to moment. And you might include with that certain intentions, like you're going to try to be mindful of certain things, like you're going to try to pay attention to like pitch accent or the usage of words or just how much you're understanding or something like that. So it seems like what you're talking about is like how to just not get caught up in a sentence, but I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, like I'm sure we've all experienced where you're listening to something, you half understand a sentence or you mostly understand a sentence, but there's just something about it that you want to spend a little bit more time on because there's something interesting about the sentence, and you're like, wait, like maybe you understood it, but you just had a realization like, wait, is this word the same as that other word, or are they different, or like, wait, is this word that pitch accent or not? And so I actually think it's probably a good thing to pause and take a moment to think about that, because it will, you might learn something. It might make it click more. And I always kind of did that. I never thought of it as a bad thing. I mean, if you get excessive about it, then it's a bad thing, right? Like if you are like, wait, I thought I knew this grammar pattern, but I don't see how it's working here. And you spend like more than like 15 to 30 seconds thinking about it, then at that point, it's probably unproductive. So you definitely want to let go quickly. But if you feel like, oh, maybe if I thought about this for 15 seconds, I would understand it more, then it might be worth it, because that 15 seconds might make something click. and that whatever clicks, you might take that with you, and then you might understand more later. And I always think it's good to be extra attentive to the language, really try to be noticing as much as possible, because I really think that's kind of what sets good languages apart from more mediocre language learners, is just their ability to really pay attention to things, because there's so many little nuanced details that you need to function like a native. And as an adult learning a language, your brain just isn't as naturally attentive as, the unconscious mind of a child. And that's the reality. So yeah, I'd say I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Just don't get too excessive about it, and, let go quickly. Don't do it too often. And when it happens, maybe just actually pause if you can. I mean, if you are doing passive listening and you're in the middle of cooking and you can't pause, at that point, maybe just let it go, or maybe take a mental note and then go back to it later, look it up later. But, if you have kind of an OCD-like tendency where you're just literally man, every 5 seconds I'm getting caught up in a sentence and I can't follow anything, at that point, then I would probably recommend, meditation and just trying to set an intention at the beginning. Just set your intention to, okay, I know my mind's going to get caught up on stuff, but I'm going to try to let go of that as soon as possible and just go back. And if you practice that like it's a skill, and you combine it with, meditation to build some fundamental mindfulness abilities, then you should get better and better at that. And so if it's becoming a problem for you, then that's what I would recommend. Okay, so Lucas asks, I think it would be interesting if you talked a bit about overall Anki setup. Maybe how you would organize the way that you use Anki with all these applications like Subs SRS, Morphman, and Yomi-chan's Anki Connect, etc. Would you still create cards manually at all? Should I put those cards in a separate deck? At the moment, I'm trying to get a more tidy Anki workflow, but don't know where to start. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. Well, actually, that's a really big topic, and I plan on making a video talking just about this in the future. I'm actually waiting because I know that there's some Anki add-ons that are going to come out in the near future, which are going to play a big role in the Anki setup I'm going to be talking about. And that's why I'm kind of holding off on it. And so I kind of want to just say, wait a few weeks and you'll get a video from me. But I also kind of think that this is the type of thing where everyone will have to kind of experiment and find what works for them, There's a lot of other videos online about people talking about their specific setup when it comes to using all these tools with Anki and sentence mining and stuff. And I don't think there's one best way. I think different people are going to find that different setups work best for them, and it's the type of thing that you should probably play around with a little bit and experiment with a little bit to find out what works best for you. But I will talk about my specific recommendations in the future once all the add-ons that I have in mind come to fruition. So sorry to kind of delay the answer, but hopefully eventually I'll be able to come up with something good. So Shkabach asks, so say you get a Kindle and set it up like in your new video so that you can easily look up words on the fly and really optimize reading immersion. How many hours of reading per day do you think you would have to do in order to not use Anki at all and simply learn how to read by reading a shitload? Let's say given the parameters of 18 months. So comparatively to an age-editor using Anki for 1-2 hours a day, how much would one have to read in order to get a similar result without using the SRS? Okay, so you specified how much time that the age-editor is using Anki, but you didn't specify how much time they're immersing. So let's say, and again, this is totally hypothetical, I don't really know because no one has done any studies on this, right? I don't really know anyone who's used age-at-type methods minus the SRS. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't personally know that many. And so it's hard for me to have an idea of how much the SRS makes a difference, right? I just watched a video by Brit vs. Japan recently where he was talking about whether you need to sentence mine or not. And he kind of said the same thing. It's no one really knows exactly how important it is because no one's done any scientific studies on this type of stuff, right? So it's all just speculation. So I could be totally off. I don't want you to take this as fact or anything. So this is just given what my experience is and what I know, what I would guess. And I would say that, let's see. So let's say that someone's reading 3 hours a day and then they're doing SRS, then they're SRSing 1 hour a day, for a total of 4 hours. How many hours would the other person have to read to achieve the same results? Well, first of all, it totally depends on where they are in the process. You said given the parameters of 18 months, and so it's hard to just say overall, because like in the very beginning, SRS makes things very quickly, because it's like there's something about, I was talking about this with Yoga Pants the other day, like there's something about the intervals in the SRS where like you review the first day, then the third day, then the seventh day or whatever. When you do that, it really just burns things into your mind in a way that nothing else does. And me and Lucas both have the experience. Sorry, Yoga Pants' name is Lucas, and so that's how I know him as. Lucas both me and Lucas have had the experience multiple times, like countless times, where you SRS something for like a year and then you can delete the card and then you remember it for years after that, like so crisp, And I can remember all the cards that I had in my original deck and like exactly what wording was on the back of the card. It just burns things in. And so at the very beginning, when you're really bad at just learning words or learning anything in the language because you have no infrastructure in your brain yet, you just started and the whole language is completely foreign to you, like, although it is true that the basic words that you need to learn like come up all the time, it's still just, I think, easier to learn them in the context of the SRS when it's just really focused and isolated. It's like, hey, what does this word mean? What does this sentence mean? And then you have the built-in intervals where you're consciously spending time with each word, like following the algorithm. It just really burns the things in a way that it's hard to do without the SRS. And this is at the beginning. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum where you're very advanced, right? You know all the most common words, yet there's still a lot of words that natives know and you don't. But these are words that come up maybe just a few times a year if you're getting a lot of immersion, so you don't really have an opportunity to burn them in. And so the SRS is also really good for these type of things, because if you're just leaving it to immersion, it's going to be really hard to get to the point where you really know that stuff well. And again, if you want to compare yourself to a native, it's like it took natives there's this statistic that I heard a long time ago that always stuck with me, that the average 40-year-old English speaker has a passive vocabulary that's twice as large as the average 20-year-old. And on average, they learn about one word a day. And so this means that it took a 20-year-old 20 years to get to the point where he had the vocabulary that he does, and he's still not done, right? He's going on and learning continually. So it's like, the reason why I cited that statistic is that even when you get to a 20-year-old, right, they're not done learning yet, right? They're still learning all the time. Yet it still took them 20 years to get to where they are. And natives learn an average of much more than one word per day when they're up until they're 20. And they're also using the language 24/7. And so if it took a native speaker 20 years to get to the point where he knows as much words as he does, then, I mean, you can expect a similar thing to happen to you. I mean, of course, you can make the argument that, it'll be quicker because you're smarter, you're an adult, you have more analytical abilities, like blah, blah, blah. And maybe you are more smart about what you choose to what you choose to immerse with, and so you learn more efficiently, and so on. And those things might be very well true, but at the same time, like, if your goal is to effectively catch up to a native speaker, like, the person who's not using an SRS, doesn't really have a shot if he's competing with the guy that does have the SRS. Because with the SRS, you can learn 10 words a day, no problem. And I think it's going to be hard to learn 10 words a day and maintain all 10 words if you, after a certain point, once you're already extremely advanced, right? When the words that you're learning are the words that come up, once or twice a year, yet all natives still know them. And there's thousands and thousands of words like that. It's that is it, you can expect it to take you as long as it took a native to get to that point. Or, I mean, maybe you can cut the time down by half. Maybe it'll only take you 10 years instead of 20 years. But still, you don't really have a chance. Now, in the middle period, when, you're not a beginner anymore, so learning words isn't too difficult, and you're not advanced yet, so there's still lots of words to learn that come up regularly, then I don't think the SRS matters as much. And if you're getting a lot of immersion, then you can easily make the same progress as a beginner. And also at the beginning, if you get lots of, if you still spend time, Like, if you get lots of immersion, you'll still be able to push past the beginner stage, even though I think it'll be quicker with the SRS. I think that you won't be able to. You'll still be able to get past it. And so I really think that it comes down to, so let's say if we broadly talk about learning a language in those 3 stages, I think at the beginning, let's say that we have someone who's reading, again, so they're reading 3 hours a day and they're using the SRS for 1 hour. In order to catch up with that person, to make the same progress as that person in the beginning stage, let's say that you would have to read like 5 or 6 hours a day, maybe. And then we're talking about the more middle stage where you already know all the basic words, you have some basic infrastructure, but there's still a lot of common words to learn. Then maybe you would only have to read 4 hours a day, and then the age adder is still just doing 3 hours plus making 1 hour on Anki. So maybe you only have to read a little bit more at that point. But then if you want to get to the point where you're already advanced, you're already totally fluent, but you're trying to close the gap in vocabulary between you and native level, you'd probably have to, I don't think it's really possible. Like, you could probably read all day, but you still, like, in the long term, you'll still lose because of the nature of the SRS. Like, I actually surpassed natives in like 3 or 4 years. Like, I caught up to them and I surpassed them. And I was just doing like 10 cards a day. With with lots of immersion, like maybe close to like a lot of days I would read like more than 3 hours, and I would also do lots of listening immersion and stuff. But I caught up to natives and I surpassed them, and like lots of times when I'm hanging out with my Japanese friends, we could be watching Japanese TV and a word will come up and they'll be like, and they won't know it. They'll be like, wait, and cause, like, they'll ask me because they know that I know it, and they're like, Matt, what is that? You know that word? What does it mean? And I know it, and I'm not, and of course now I'm not that surprised, but part of me is still a little bit like, what? You don't know that? You're Japanese. And so honestly, and also like I know I've met people who like lived in Japan for many years, and they're very good at Japanese. Like, they're totally fluent. Maybe overall they're even like better than me when it comes to speaking ability and expressing themselves naturally and easily, and maybe they can even understand some things better than me because they have such high intuition. But there's still like words that they don't know that all natives do know, right? Like little things like the names for all the different type of teeth you have. I know the names in Japanese for all the different teeth that you have that native speakers know, right? Or like specific types of like birds and plants and like the names of all the planets and like let me think if I can think of any other crazy ideas, like the different bones in your body. And these are things that native speakers usually know, but like those people, they don't know them, and in their mind they've already given up. They're like, oh well, those things don't matter that much anyway, and how are you supposed to learn all that stuff? And yeah, they don't matter that much, except they still do come up, and every time they come up, you're gonna feel like you're a 4-year-old who doesn't know what's going on, when everyone else around you does. And so I kind of like overall, and this is my opinion after quitting the SRS for like over 6 months, I actually realized like what I predicted what was going to happen is that I'd realize it wasn't as important as I thought, and the opposite happened. I actually realized how important it was, and I started forgetting things that I used to know, and then every once in a while those things would come up and I'd be like, oh, I used to know this, but now I'm kind of rusty on it. And that's because like I don't have like I'm 24. I haven't spent 24 years using Japanese all day, every day, like Japanese people, right? I've spent like 7 years of using it some of the time, right? And so even though I knew a lot of stuff due to the SRS, like it's not locked in as deep as the natives are, right? Because you can't beat time, right? You can't beat sheer hours spent in the language. They've spent way more hours than me, and so the words that they do know are way more locked in. But for me, I still like knew more words because I had memorized them with the SRS, but I lost them relatively quickly after I stopped SRSing because I wasn't doing 24 hours immersion, and I never even had enough immersion to like earn those words in the first place, right? Like when you earn a word, meaning you just learn it through immersion because you see it so many times, like you'll probably never really forget it. And so if you want to like earn native level, that takes as much time as it takes natives to get to native level. But you can basically like hack native level with the SRS and effectively get there, like in like 5 to 10 years. But that is still relying on the SRS. And so when you take out the SRS, you start to quickly lose everything you hadn't earned yet. And I realized that, and then I started SRSing again. And, Katsumoto made a post about this a while ago. And when Katsumoto, and he basically came to the same conclusion. He's like, he has a post where he's like, why SRS after fluency? And he basically said that, like the same thing that I expressed. It's like he stopped using the SRS after he moved to Japan, and he felt that his knowledge started to fall away. And that was only when he had been learning Japanese for like 18 months to 2 years. And so when I read that post, he gives a few examples of the words that he started to forget. And those are words that, to me, I already have earned, and I know I'm not going to forget. So I was like, oh, maybe that only applies when you're at a level below where I am now. Because, at that point, I'd been learning Japanese for 6 to 7 years, and Katsumoto had only been doing it for 2 years. So it could make sense that the logic doesn't apply. But I found that it does apply, and there's still so many things that the only thing that's holding my knowledge in place is still the SRS to this day. And I want to keep having that knowledge, at least until I'm have lived in Japan and used Japanese full time for 10 years. Because right now I don't even use Japanese that many hours a day. And so basically, yeah, I think the SRS is an invaluable tool that can't really be replaced with any amount of immersion if you are fighting on the same time scale. Besides that middle portion of language learning. And honestly, that's what most people are talking about. Like most language learners, most polyglots, they never get past that. They never try to catch up to natives. And that's totally fine. And, maybe that's more pragmatic for most people. Like, maybe it's not worth trying to get to native level. And in that case, the SRS maybe isn't that important, because if you just grind pretty hard through the beginner stage and then you read a lot, hey, you can go from intermediate to advanced. But, and I think that's why all the polyglots that are talking about that they don't need an SRS, like Steve Kaufman, they don't get to native level in any of their languages. And you got to keep that in mind. Like, not hating on Steve. Wait, if I just said Stephen Krashen, I meant Steve Kaufman. Can't remember. Maybe I didn't. Anyway, polyglots like Steve Kaufman, like, I'm not saying that he's incompetent or anything, because I'm sure he could get to native level in some of his languages if he wanted to. He doesn't want to because he's not interested in that, and that's totally cool. But you have to keep in mind that his advice might not necessarily apply to trying to reach a near native level, because that's not what he does. And he's never reached a near native level in any of his languages, as far as I know. And his languages like Japanese aren't that great. So Alex Rogers asks, hey Matt, could you talk about why you think pitch accent is more difficult than Chinese tones? I'm learning both Japanese and Chinese, and in the beginning, Chinese tones seem to be more difficult than Japanese pitch accent. The reason why this is because Japanese pitch accent works on a per word basis, similar to how stress accent works in Western languages. You basically have to learn that instead of stress accent. In Japanese, there's pitch accent. So you have to learn this new way of producing word accent, but you sort of put it into the same place in your mind. Chinese tones, on the other hand, work on a per syllable basis, and this is a completely new pattern. Once you've got and this is a completely new pattern that you've got to learn that's completely different from the per word stress or pitch accent. So you have to start from scratch. I found it very taxing for the mind to remember to pay attention to the tone of each syllable, since it's phonetic. And before Chinese, from the point of view of my experience, it never used to be. So I was wondering what your thoughts on this were and what your experience was. I'm also curious about how you approach tones during your short streak of learning Chinese, or perhaps how you would approach them if you hypothetically decided to learn Chinese, and what you do differently now with pitch accent. Okay, so I wrote down that there's four main reasons why pitch accent is difficult. So this is not necessarily comparing it to tones, but this is just first why Japanese pitch accent is difficult. First of all, the rules are complicated. So there's many rules, right? If you just know the pitch accent of a word in isolation, that's not very useful to you, because you have to know, when it's actually used in a sentence, what are all the rules that apply to it that change the accent, right? Like if you have the verb like taberu, well, what about when it becomes like tabenai, right? What is it? Well, it's tabenai. And that's because taberu is a non-heibon verb, and when non-heibon verbs are in the nai form, it drops before the nai. But you have to know that, otherwise the fact that you know that taberu is taberu in the dictionary form isn't that useful to you. But sometimes there's multiple layers of rules that all apply at the same time, right? If you said like 食べない kurai, well, in that case, like if you had 食べない, that would be okay. Well, so a non-heibon verb that has nai drops before the na. But when you add kurai on to top of it, that overrides what comes before the kurai, and then the whole thing becomes flat, and then it drops on the kurai. So it's like 食べない kurai. And you have to know all of that. But those are only like 2 rules. There's times where like 4 or 5 rules all apply at once. Like for example, if you so normally if a word is odaka, then like the particle that attaches to it drops down low. So for example, like if you said hana desu, which it's a flower, the des drops low. It's hana desu. If you said hana desu and the des didn't drop low, then it would mean nose. But if you have a 1-syllable word, then this rule So, but if you add the particle no to an odaka word, it overrides the drop and it becomes heibon. So if you said hana no naka, that could mean in the flower or in the nose. You don't say hana no naka. But this rule doesn't apply if the word is 1 syllable. So if you have a 1-syllable word, which means it could be either odaka or heibon, then it's still, the no does drop low. It doesn't override it. So, for example, he, meaning fire, is normally odaka, which means it would be hi desu. But if you add no, it's still like hi no naka. The no still drops no. So so basically if it's 1 syllable, then the no principle doesn't apply. Now there's this other rule that if the drop of a word is from the second to last mora, and the last mora is what's called a tokushuhaku, which means that it's either a small tsu, or an extended vowel, then those words tend to be treated like odaka words. So nihon has the accent on the second mora, which is also the second to last mora, so it's nihon desu. But if you add on no, because when no attaches onto odaka words, it makes the word heibon, and because words whose accent is on the second to last mora, whose last mora is a tokushuhaku, tend to be treated as odaka, nihon no naka. It becomes like that. So it becomes flat when you add the no, nihon no naka. But sometimes this rule doesn't apply if the word is the type of word that could also be used as an adverb. So, sorry, the sun is like moving now, there's light on me. So like, for example, if you said taksan. So taksan has the accent on the second to last mora, and the last accent is unna tokushuhaku, so it would be taksan desu. But when you add on no, because taksan can also be used as an adverb, then it doesn't happen, and it still becomes taksan no nanika, usually. Same thing with jubun no. And also, words who follow this pattern, whose accent is on the second to last mora, and the last mora is a tokushuhaku, if they are used as an adverb, then they become heibon. So it becomes taksan, like hito ga taksan iru, that taksan is flat. But if you said taksan no hito ga iru, then it keeps the fall, even though it's a no. So anyway, I don't know if that made any sense, if you could follow that, if you weren't already quite familiar with pitch accent. But basically, there's a boatload of rules, and they're very complicated. Sometimes multiple rules apply at once. And basically, I mean, either you have to consciously know this very well, or you have to have practiced a shit ton, or your unconscious mind has to have figured all this out. Now, let's compare that to Chinese tones. There's like almost no rules. Like, there's like 4 rules total or something. Like, when you have 2 third tones in a row, then the first one becomes second tone, right? So it's like, it's instead of being like ni hao, it's like ni hao, because like the ni is, they're both third tone, but the first one becomes second tone. If you don't know about Chinese, this probably won't make that much sense to you. But and then there's a few more, like if like for the word for one, if that follows certain syllables or certain accents, it changes. But basically there's only like 4 rules, and they're all super simple, and all of them you have to look at most 1 syllable ahead of you, right? And so rules are basically like not an issue in Chinese. They're not nearly as complicated with Japanese. And that brings me to the next reason why pitch accent is difficult, is that you have to look very far ahead in certain situations. And so this is kind of part of the first thing that I talked about. But basically, like, so I just explained before how when you add, so it's, when you say Nihon des, it's Nihon des. But if you add no, it becomes Nihon no naka desu. So basically, before you start saying Nihon, you have to already know whether you're going to add no or not, because it's going to change the pitch accent. But if you, for example, said like Nihonjin, Japanese person, then it actually changes the accent of the whole word. It becomes Nihonjin. It's not, so it's Nihon. Nihonjin. So it's not Nihonjin. So basically, if you're going to say Nihonjin, you have to know that you're going to say the jin before you start saying the n, because it's going to change the whole accent pattern. But if you were going to say Nihonjin teki, like Nihonjin teki na seishitsu or something, teki makes whatever comes before it flat, which means the whole thing becomes flat. Which means that if you're going to say Nihonjin teki, you have to know that you're going to add the teki before you say the n. And this can go on and on. There's certain situations where you would have to look like 10 syllables ahead before you start speaking, because otherwise it's going to change the accent. And sometimes when you hear Japanese people read a text out loud that they haven't practiced, they will make mistakes. Like the other day, I was watching a video of Suits, and he was reading a comment out loud, and the comment had the phrase meiwaku ga rareru in it. And he started saying meiwaku, because when you pronounce meiwaku in isolation, it's a tamataka, meiwaku. But because when you add garu to a noun, it makes the noun part heiban, regardless of the original pitch accent. It becomes meiwaku ga rareru. So at first he was just reading, his eye saw meiwaku, and he started saying meiwaku, and then he got to the garu, and then he had to go back and go meiwaku ga rareru and undo it. Now this would never happen in Chinese because, again, you only have to look at most one word ahead. And the other thing is that, like, because in Japanese, every kanji has a reading, right? Like, you can know that, for example, like, let's say that you have the word seikatsu. So that first character, sei, although it can have, like, ikiru, although it has a million readings, you normally know that if it's in a kanji compound, it's probably going to be sei, and the one katsu is almost always read katsu when it's in a kanji compound. So even if you had never seen the word seikatsu before, if you knew the kanji, you would probably know it's read seikatsu. And similarly, the word for hito, it can be read jin or nin. So it's a 50-50 guess, because Japanese is bullshit. But then if you saw the word jinsei for the first time, then you would probably be able to guess that it's jinsei, not ninsei. And so you can guess the reading. Same thing with Chinese. In Chinese, every single kanji has usually one reading, like 99.9% of the time, which is crazy, right? Compared to Japanese, where kanji can have up to 10 readings, every kanji has one reading. But the thing is that in Japanese, every word has a pitch accent, but there's literally no way for you to guess the pitch accent unless you already know the word. So seikatsu happens to be a heiban, and jinsei happens to be a tamadaka, but just because that you can guess the reading based off the kanji, and you know that it's jinsei and that seikatsu, seikatsu, you can't guess the pitch accent. I mean, you can guess, but your accuracy won't be very high because the patterns aren't that reliable in Japanese. Whereas in Chinese, the tone is part of the reading of the kanji, which means that if you know the, like, in Chinese, like, I don't even know if I remember, but like, jinsei also exists in Chinese, and it's like, renshang, I think. And so, like, Reng is the one for hito, it's always second tone. And like shang is the one for like sei, and it's always first tone. And so you can just know what the tone and the reading is going to be. And so basically, once you know every character in Chinese, all the basic characters and their reading and their tones, then you can learn a new word instantly. You already know the reading. Whereas in Japanese, even if you can guess the reading because you're good with kanji, you have to learn the pitch accent word by word forever, right? You never get to a point where you no longer have to be like looking up the pitch accent, because that never ends. Every single time you learn a new word, no matter how good you get, you have to look up the pitch accent as well. Whereas in Chinese, you get to a point where you pretty much don't have to look up the tone anymore because you already know what it is. And this also makes it way easier in Chinese. So we have that in Chinese. You can... it's way easier to guess because the tone is consistent as part of the kanji reading. It's not random every single time you learn a new word. Also, you only have to look at max one ahead. And so every single syllable is almost like a fresh start. And so that makes it like you use way less of your brain's RAM. But the other things with Japanese is that there's really shitty resources for Japanese. And what I mean is that there's certain structures in Japanese like that are constantly shifting. So like, for example, I was talking to my Japanese friend about how traditionally, if you're going to say if you're going to say an adjective like in the ku form plus suru, so like takaku suru or like hikuku suru, normally the accent would be takaku suru. So the takaku part would be would be a tamadaka and then suru. Takaku suru, hikuku suru. But recently, some younger people will say takaku suru and they'll say the whole thing heiban. And what my friend actually realized with me questioning him and giving him different scenarios is that when he's talking in a situation where he's talking to people above him and he has to sound formal, he says it in the original way, takaku suru. But when he's just talking to his friends, he says takaku suru. And so he actually changes which rule he applies to the structure based off of the politeness. Now, it's not that is intrinsically that difficult, except that's not written down anywhere. I had to figure that out by talking to my friend and like questioning him and like paying attention to real life Japanese. And there could be like tons of other things like that I just haven't noticed yet. And there's no way for me to know whether I've noticed it all or not because there's no resource, right? Like no one has figured it out yet. And there's lots of words whose accent, who have multiple possible accents, like over 10% of the words you look up in the dictionary, it lists multiple possible pitch accents. And you don't know which one is actually the most common one because they'll be different between different dictionaries, and they also change over time, and the dictionary has old information. So you just never know. And so, for example, there might be in the dictionary something listed as a like secondary accent, but that might actually be the one that Japanese people use in real life. Or it could be that they use both, but they use it differently depending on the situation. And so, or it might be that, older people use one and younger people use the other. And so you can't really trust the dictionary. You have to go and figure it out yourself. Sometimes the dictionary is just straight up wrong. Like if you look up deai in the dictionary, it's going to say it like that. It's going to say that all the dictionaries say that deai is heiban, but in reality it's not. It's actually nakataka. It's deai. And all Japanese people always say it deai. And if they hear it flat, they'll think that it sounds wrong. And so the resources suck. They don't explain everything. And so there's a lot of field work that you're going to have to do if you want to have perfect pitch accent, right? You're going to have to be constantly paying attention, taking notes, be like a anthropologist, like trying to study what Japanese people actually do in different situations. And you never know if you have all the answers. Whereas with Chinese, it's super simple and the dictionary tells you what the right tone is, period. There's no worrying about tones like changing over time because the older generation says it one way, young people says it another, or like they say it different in a formal situation or not. It just doesn't exist. It's just way more simple. It's just like an easier game. And it also makes sense that is the case because in Chinese, tones are crucial for communication. If you mess up your tones, then it's very likely that you're not going to be comprehensible and no one's going to be able to understand what you're saying. Whereas with Japanese, if you mess up your pitch accent, like mostly they'll probably still be able to understand you and like clear everything up through context. And so basically tones are more important in Chinese than pitch accent is in Japanese. And this means that there's a hard limit on how complicated tones can be because like in reality, Japanese people, like there's a lot of variation per person and per area in Japan when it comes to pitch accent. And it's more common to make mistakes because it's so complicated. It's like, even if you're a native, it's so fucking complicated and there's so much little subtle detail and it's like even natives end up making mistakes quite regularly. And of course, when they do make a mistake, other Japanese people will make fun of them and point it out and they'll be able to fix it. But still, it happens way more often than, for example, someone in English makes a pronunciation mistake. Even though it happens way more often in Japanese. Whereas with Chinese, like, if their system was as complicated as pitch accent, and so they made mistakes all the time, that would make Chinese like a failure of a communication tool. Because since it's so crucial for communication, if people fucked it up, like even if natives fucked it up, then it wouldn't work as a communication tool, right? It would just be like, oh, well, Chinese is a bad language to talk in because you make mistakes and then no one can understand you. So because it's so crucial for communication, there's a hard limit on how difficult and complicated it can be. because it has to, if it was above a certain level of difficulty, then even natives wouldn't be able to effortlessly master it, and then it wouldn't be a communication tool. So it makes sense that because tones are more important, they're actually necessarily more consistent and simple. And so my experience in Japanese has been that basically there's always more patterns that I'm noticing and that I'm realizing that I've missed before. I have this sense of that if I wanted to master pitch accent 100%, it would take me like 10 years of working on it every single day, like in Japan, and like constantly studying what Japanese people actually do and like taking notes and stuff. And I feel like that'll probably never happen realistically, and so I'll always just be doomed to be like stuck at like 98% accuracy, which is pretty good. But I mean, like in Chinese, it seems like, oh, if I worked as hard, like if I studied Chinese for 7 years instead of Japanese for 7 years, I would probably sound like pretty much native by now, like because tones are just way easier than pitch accent. And the reality is that there are multiple like foreign speakers of Chinese, like Westerners who learned Chinese like in their 20s and sound 100% native. Like I've heard from multiple sources that like Dashan, when he's doing stand-up comedy, he sounds like he was born and raised in Beijing. And I know a few other examples. Whereas I can't find a single Westerner who learned Japanese in their 20s and actually sounds native. They still mess up pitch accent and they still mess up pronunciation. And this is just because pitch accent is so difficult. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of undisputable that tones are at least Mandarin tones are like way easier than Japanese pitch accent for all those reasons. But in terms of my experience is, first I learned how to hear it in native speech. And basically anytime I was listening to Japanese, I would like force myself to listen. Because like, you said, Alex, that when you were listening to Chinese, your brain would just ignore the tones and you had to consciously pay attention to the tones. Well, that happened to me in Japanese, like hardcore. Like if I wasn't consciously trying to listen, like was that Heiban or was that a Tamadaka, I wouldn't notice. And so first I like just memorized the pitch accent of like some common words. And then every time that word would come up, I'd try to hear it. And I couldn't for a while, like, but then slowly I started to be able to hear it when it was obvious. Like when it was said very clearly, I could tell like, oh yeah, that sounded like it was going down, not up. And I kept doing that. Every time I listened to Japanese, I was just trying to hear the pitch. And I'd learn the pitch accent of more words. And when those words come up, I try to hear it. And over time, it got more clear and more clear. And eventually it got to the point where it was like super obvious. And like when I heard Japanese, it was like, whoa, it's so obvious. It's like a roller coaster. Like Tamadaka words sound nothing at all like Heiban words. Like it's not just about the pitch. It's about like the whole way they say the word and like stress and timing and everything. It's like every word sounds so, like every pitch accent pattern sounds so unique from each other. And it was like, how the fuck did I miss this before? And it's not that it's actually obvious. It's just that whenever you get really good at something, you can't remember what it was like to not be good at it. It's like with anything, right? It's like, hey, I like spent like hundreds of hours listening to Japanese trying to hear the pitch. I got really good at hearing the pitch. And then it was like, felt obvious. It was like, how did I not notice it before? Because that's what it means to be good, right? It's like automatic. It's like you just hear it. It's not like you have to try. If you're good, it's not like you have to try to hear it. You just hear it. And because of that, it seems obvious, even though it's really not. And after that point, I would continue to just always listen to Japanese. I'd start noticing more and more patterns. I would be able to do it more quickly. I would be able to like hear it in real time. And I started to be able to like notice when like other people's pitch accent was different or anything. And then at one point, I know I had like a paradigm shift in my brain where like pitch accent like became a fundamental part of my unconscious model of the language. And I can't pinpoint to like a moment when it happened, but I know that there was like a shift. And after that point, like I couldn't really read Japanese at a certain point because I would realize that I literally like didn't know how to pronounce the word. Like my brain knew it's like there's only 4 patterns possible. And like I would like not know what the pattern would be. And so I'd be like reading and I'd come across a word and it would be like, let's see, like here, like jisai ni wa. I would come across this word and I'd know the kanji reading. I know it was like jisai, but I just wouldn't know how to pronounce it. I was like, is it jisai ni wa or is it jisai ni wa? And those two possibilities sounded so different to me. I was like, I don't know which one it is. And it sounded so wrong. It'd be the difference between being like, should I say, doctor or doctor? Right? And I literally didn't know. And and it bothered me so much. It was like, wait, I'm just going around flipping a coin whether I'm going to say doctor or doctor. Like, oh yeah, I have a doctor appointment tomorrow. I have a doctor appointment tomorrow. Do you want to go with me? It would be so great if you could go with me. It's like all this weird stuff that basically the Japanese equivalent of that. And so then it would be like I couldn't read because every single word would be like, fuck, I don't know how to pronounce it. And over time, I like learned the pitch accent of more and more words, and my intuition got like better and sharper. And then I eventually learned how to kind of like turn that off a little bit, so I can just ignore the pitch a little bit when I'm reading, but I still like. It's like before, pitch accent wasn't part of my subvocalization. Now it is, and so I couldn't really ignore it in the same way. And that just happened through paying attention to it so much in my immersion. And after that kind of shift happened, I would find that if I knew the pitch accent of a word, I could, when I used that word in a conversation, I would usually say the word right. And it was different than conscious knowledge. It was just like how you know what kana to write the word with. It's like, you know, it's jinsei and not shinsei. Well, it's just like, well, you know, it's jinsei and not jinsei. It's just like, you just know it. It wasn't like, it was kind of conscious knowledge, but it was also kind of just like, you know, the word sounds. And so you just say it how you know it's supposed to sound. And so, yeah, it was this huge paradigm shift, and it was really difficult at first because it was like realizing that I suck. It was like, oh wow, when I speak Japanese, I'm just rolling the dice on how to pronounce this like huge component of the language. And as time passes more and more, it like becomes like it's like once you cross that point and have that paradigm shift, when your brain gets it, then everything makes perfect sense because you realize like, oh, pitch accent is super important, and if you mess up pitch accent, you sound so silly. And it's not even that difficult to speak with correct pitch accent. You just have to like get your mind to like realize it. And now whenever you're immersing, your brain is actually like recording more data. Because like now when I'm listening, like when I hear a new word, my brain automatically notices the pitch accent of it. Whereas before it wouldn't. And so it's like, man, if you just invest the initial effort to like have the paradigm shift, then like you just are getting free benefits all the time because every single time you're immersed, your brain is literally noticing more information. And so like I see people who are like, oh, I don't want to learn pitch accent. It's like too much effort. Like it doesn't even matter that much anyway. And I'm like, oh man, like I can see your perspective, but you just literally don't get it. Like if only you could like see it from my point of view, like if only you could listen to how Japanese sounds to me for like 30 seconds, then you would not be able to say that anymore. But there's no way for me to like get that across that well without also sounding like really arrogant. But it's like, it only seems like it's not important because you're not able to perceive it yet. Once you're able to perceive it, you realize like messing up the pitch accent is just like messing up the vowel pretty much. Like it's just as big of a mistake. I mean, not literally, but it's like pretty close. And so, yeah, now my experience is that like, when I learn a word, I learn it with the pitch accent because otherwise I don't know how to pronounce it. And then when I say it, I normally say it right. And I know that there's still certain exact structures that I don't know the pitch accent of. Like when I'm reading a book, especially because, you know, when you're reading, there's certain structures that just like don't really come up in normal speech. And I'll just realize like, oh, what's the pitch accent for this? And it's like, I can always narrow it down to like two possibilities because it's normally like there's two rules conflicting. And in this exact scenario, I don't know which rule like takes priority. And so it's like, if I got a Japanese person to tell me, then I could like update my model and be like, oh, in this exact scenario, this one takes priority. And I've like been working on that slowly over time, but there's still like certain structures that I just don't know. And I also know that even if I do know something when I'm speaking, I'll still just like unconsciously mess stuff up. Like I know I just have low accuracy and I'll need to practice a lot to like get my accuracy up. And there's probably other words like I know I have a list in my mind of all the words that have multiple pitch accents, but a lot of them I don't know which ones Japanese people actually say. Because like I haven't really like heard them. I haven't heard enough different people say it yet, like since I like got into pitch accent. And so like certain words like eiga, right? Like movie, like I do hear people say it both ways, like eiga. That one you can say either way. But there's other words like kikai, like an opportunity, that like Japanese people always say it as second tone with the pitch accent on the second mora. But in the dictionary, it said in Daijin, it says that it can be 0 or 2, but no one said it as 0. And it's like, I know it for that, but there's other more obscure words that are less common that I don't really know how people actually say it. And there's certain other things like counters. Like, I don't know, I haven't memorized like exactly what happens with because like there's different, there's like two different possibilities of what happens when like a suffix attaches to a word, and there's like close to 10 possibilities of like what's going to happen when counters attach to numbers, like depending on the counter. And I haven't memorized any of those yet, so I probably fucked up those a lot. And there's like a few other things that I like would have to memorize a lot of shit to get, that I will do eventually. But overall, I know that I'm like infinitely more accurate than I was before. And I notice when other people are not accurate. And so basically it all comes down to perception. It's like, if you can hear the pitch accent, like when you're listening to Japanese, if you can get to that point where it sounds obvious to you, then you've pretty much beat the game, because you're going to be taking down pitch accent for information when you're listening to Japanese, which means you're going to be building your intuition for what it's supposed to sound like, and then you're going to notice when you say it wrong. And even if you can get to that point where you have the paradigm shift, even if you don't go and study all the specific rules, you'll probably be able to get to like above 90% accuracy. Like just because you'll now be able to hear it once you get to that paradigm shift point. And so with tones, I think it'd be the same thing. It would be like, first, learn about the tones consciously. Then when you learn words, memorize what the tone is. And then when you listen to Chinese, try to hear the tone. And if you keep doing that, like every time you listen to Chinese, you actually consciously try to hear the tones, I think you'll get better and better at it slowly. And then you'll reach a tipping point where your brain like gets it. And then it will sound super obvious and you won't really have trouble with it anymore. And then when someone says something with the wrong tone, you literally will be like, wait, what did you just say? That's not how you say that word. And then I don't think it'll be that much trouble. And then there's like no complicated rules or inconsistencies with Chinese. It's like super easy to learn. So after that point, it'd be a breeze. So, yeah. I was going to do 3 more questions, but I think I'm just going to do 1 more because this ended up being super long. But Eric Wolf asks, did you do your April Fool's video in 1 take, or did you make several attempts before settling on the video that you uploaded? I did like half a take before that. Like in the shower, I was thinking like, I like had the idea for it. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if I did this? Then I got out of the shower and I started recording, and I like had no idea what I was going to say. And I like started doing the introduction. And then I realized that I had a consultation in like 20 minutes. And so I had to like just like finish it and upload it like really soon. So then I just like stopped it, did it again. And I was like, this is it. And then like for the first half of the video, I was saying similar stuff to what I said in my first like half take. And so it was like, I knew what I was going to say. But then on the second half, like I literally had no idea what I was going to say. And I was like 100% improvising. And it's kind of funny, like because I was improvising, my accent got better because it like took conscious effort to like try to make my accent sound more gaijin. And talking about pitch accent, the funny thing is that when I watched the video back, I realized that like my pitch accent was still like way more accurate than it was in my Jiko Shokai video. Because in my mind, it's like, although I'm saying, it's like, if I say, instead of saying like, Nihon, like instead of saying Nihongo, if I said Nihongo, then although my pronunciation is bad, you can still tell what word it is. But if you change the pitch accent, that can actually like change the meaning of the word. So I'm like, well, if I say like Nihongo, then like my intuition is like, well, if I mess up the pitch accent too much, then Japanese people like might literally not be able to understand it. It's like, it's different. It's like saying something with a bad accent is different than like saying the wrong thing, right? And so it actually felt like I couldn't mess up the pitch accent. It was like harder. I would have to like consciously try, because like even though I can just switch my vowels, and it's easy to be like, instead of being like, oh, そうですね、もう日本語難しいですよね, and then making that be like, oh, そうですね、日本語難しいですよね. I can do that, but the pitch accent is still there, because in my mind it's like that's like part of the word. It's hard to be like, そうですね, 日本語は難しいですよね. It's like actually harder, and so that was kind of funny to see. And also there was times where I actually said some like stuff that like when I showed it to Lucas after I filmed it, he was like, dude, you were too good. You should have like been way worse. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like my grammar is almost perfect in the whole video. And like I say some like pretty like funny stuff. Like I was like, どんぐらい素晴らしい人間なのか見抜いてくれないし or something. And it's like no gaijin would say that. Like I mean like no gaijin actually sucked. So yeah, it was kind of funny that how hard it was to actually suck when you haven't practiced. Well, when you like actually don't suck and you haven't practiced. But anyway, thanks for your guys' questions. Thanks for supporting me. Cool stuff coming soon, and keep up the hard work, guys.